Let me get you pissed off a little about the budget and the deficit and the claims being made, because these claims are key. We've got the Bidenomics Strikes Back mug right here. It is available at studoesmerch.com. The code is STU10, I think, for 10% off. I don't know, give it a shot. But you can go get your mug if you want, because Bidenomics Striking Back is a big portion of what they're going to try to do here. They're trying to tell you that Bidenomics is working. And a couple of the things they're trying to do, number one, is they're trying to say the deficit has come down. Now, let me give you what he said in the State of the Union. This is just one of the moments that infuriated me. And if you were watching the coverage, you probably saw me lose my mind, as I did multiple times during the State of the Union coverage right here on The Blaze. But here it is, Joe Biden on the deficit from the State of the Union.
By the way, the first couple of years, we cut the deficit. Now, let me speak to the question of fundamental fairness for all Americans. I've been delivering real results in fiscally responsible ways. We've already cut the federal deficit. Over $1 trillion. I signed the bipartisan deal
Did ya?
to cut another $1 trillion in the next decade. It's my goal to cut the federal deficit another $3 trillion by making big corporations and very wealthy finally beginning to pay their fair share.
Now, in between the slurring and the speed reading there, you did pick up a claim. $1 trillion he claims he has cut. Now, of course, that's down from his previous cuts. We'll go through the numbers here just so you know exactly what they're doing, because it's important. If they get away with this claim, the likelihood is that Joe Biden will win the election. That is true. If people believe that the Biden economy is as good as the media tells them, they will likely win the election, and they will go off on a sunset honeymoon together. That's what happens with the media and Democratic candidates. If people believe the economy is good, typically Democrats are going to win. Here is, let me give you this. This is a CBO budget outlook headline update to the budget 2020 to 2030. And I thought what was interesting about this is going back in time and looking at where people thought things would go. Now, I'll give you this to start it. Deficits. CBO projects a federal budget deficit of $3.3 trillion in 2020, more than triple the shortfall recorded in 2019. That increase is mostly the result of the economic disruption caused by the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and the enactment of legislation in response. So we all know this, right? Every single one of you and every single person in the gallery and every single person in the White House and every single person across the nation knows this generalized storyline. They might not know the facts, but they know the generalized storyline, which is, hey, we were going along, chugging along pretty well. Then we had a minor interruption, you might remember, called COVID-19. Everyone had to go home. No one could work, or at least we were told that no one could work. So the government shelled out trillions of dollars to keep the economy running for this short period of time. And it was supposed to bounce back to normal after, whatever it was, a year. And then, things would go back to generally normal. So the fact that he's claiming a budget savings here is tough. What is he using? Well, he's using this blip in the budget data to try to act as if he's done a good job with the budget. Let me give you the facts here. If you go back to 2018 and 2019, Donald Trump had deficits of $0.8 trillion or $800 billion and $1 trillion. So about $900 billion was his average. Biden in 2022 and 2023 has $1.4 trillion and $1.7 trillion. So an average of 1.55. How do you make $900 billion turning into $1.55 trillion into a good move? How do you do something like that? Well, you focus just on what we were talking about. You just measure yourself against peak COVID spending, which we all know is completely insane. Everyone knew that spending was going away, including Joe Biden, although he fought that as hard as he could. Now, let me give you, this is a breakdown. By the way, let's pin this on my Twitter feed so people can share it after today's show. But let me give this to you real quick. The COVID era spending expired as scheduled, which of course had absolutely nothing to do with Joe Biden. He wasn't even in office when these things were passed. So these are bills that were passed. They were supposed to expire. They expired as scheduled. Now, it would be one thing if you're Rand Paul, right? Like if Rand Paul comes out and he says, well, I was opposed to that spending at the time, Well, then maybe it would be fair to say, okay, you should compare me to peak COVID spending because I opposed peak COVID spending. But of course, that's not what Joe Biden did at all. Joe Biden supported this spending, as did the entire Democratic Party. If anything, they criticized Trump for not spending enough. And by not spending enough, they caused death and economic destruction because of it. Then Joe Biden came in, and what did he do? He extended that spending even further, and then he tried to do it again with $3.5 trillion of spending, but finally he was rebuffed. He got some of that stuff through in later bills. He is claiming credit for a reduction in spending that he outwardly opposed, and the chart kind of tells the story pretty easily. Look at this. This is the expired COVID spending CBO graph. By the way, Chartapalooza today. Chartapalooza is the way of the world. There you go. So Chartapalooza, we're going to give you 100 charts if we can today. But here's the expired COVID spending graph. And what you see here is some deficits, about $1 trillion in 2019. I should point out at this time that I was critical of Donald Trump's spending levels. $1 trillion in spending is $2 trillion in deficit, is too much. But look at the line without the two COVID years. You see a massive 40% increase and a 70% increase off 2019 as you go into 2023. What Joe Biden does is compare himself only to those peak years, which everyone knows is crazy. And as I pointed out in the initial quote from the CBO, they said this was going to be short-term, expired debt. This is going to come, it's going to go. We're dealing with COVID. When it's over, this is gone. Everyone knew that. Joe Biden tried to make it worse, did make it worse, and then tried to make it even worse after that, then claimed credit for the reductions that he opposed. This is where we are. Now, you might say, well, we don't know. It's counterfactual, right? Donald Trump wasn't president through those years. Maybe he would have passed the same spending measures. Now, we all know that's not true, but let's go down this line anyway. Once COVID hit and we knew that the spending of trillions of dollars to cushion the economy after the shutdowns would go away, the CBO projected what the deficit would be after the emergency spending ended. So they had an idea what was coming. They said this is going to expire. This is what this should look like. They projected $3.31 trillion in 2020 as a deficit. Then it goes down to $1.81 trillion in 2021. In 2022, it's $1.34 trillion. In 2023, it's $1.12 trillion. So you get the point. Starts off way up at $3 trillion, comes down and gradually, and then gets back to quote unquote normal, which is $1.12 trillion. But what were the actual numbers? Well, in 2020, it was $3.13 trillion. It was actually 5% lower than they projected. But 2021, it was 54% over projections. $2.78 trillion of deficit. 2022, it was $1.38 trillion, just a little bit over the projections, but still a little higher. And then 2023, $1.7 trillion, 52% above projections. They knew what the budget was supposed to look like, and Biden still cleared it by a mile. It's an embarrassment. Let me give you where these numbers come from. Here's the CBO baseline budget projections, and it's a bunch of numbers on a chart, hard to really spot, but let me zoom in on where we get these numbers for. They're down here. You see, let's zoom in again. We see $3.3 trillion, or as just because the government is really makes things easy, $3,311 billion. Legitimately, that's how they actually tell these stories in these charts. $3,311 billion in deficit, then $1.8 trillion, $1.336 trillion, and then $1.124 trillion. Let me just show you one other number just for the freaking fun of it. And when I mean the fun of it, meaning that it's going to ruin all of your grandchildren's and children's lives. Here, if you look at the end of this column, you see $1.627 trillion. And I bring that up only because last year's deficit was $1.7 trillion. That $1.627 trillion number, way on the other side of that chart, what is that? The projections for 2030. Joe Biden has already defeated the projections of 2030 in 2023. And he's bragging about it. This is insanity. And this is how I summed it up. By the way, again, this is up at twitter.com/StuDosAmerica or x.com/StuDosAmerica. In short, Biden is taking credit for a massive cut in spending he had nothing to do with. In fact, he opposed the cut. In fact, He supported even more spending. In fact, he has increased the deficit far beyond projections made after COVID hit. In fact, even when all COVID spending is removed and properly treated as an anomaly, his deficits are far higher than anything that preceded him. In fact, he knows all of this, and he still bragged about it. Now, he did the same thing on multiple issues. This is his way. He does something that's terrible, it comes out terribly, it slightly comes off its worst levels, and then he brags about it. This is Joe Biden 101, bragging constantly about being the second worst of all time, even though he also was the worst of all time earlier on in his administration. This is what's happening with inflation as well. It's also happening with jobs. Let me show you the jobs thing. He said over and over again how many jobs he's created. Now, of course, anyone can create jobs when you force all the businesses to close for a year. It's easy. What you have to say is, hey, don't be closed anymore. And then everyone opens up and all the jobs get created. He's claiming credit for that, but he didn't even do that, we should point out. He actually wanted the businesses closed longer. And then he's taking credit for the jobs. By the way, how wonderful is the economy economically? Yes, the jobs are much higher than when we had COVID shutdowns, but are they any better than the end of the time period before COVID? Has it improved at all? No. Here's the unemployment chart. And by the way, one of the things that COVID did do is ruin charts, the scale of charts, because the COVID year just goes off the charts almost. But you see the obviously giant spike around COVID, and then it comes back down to normal after a pretty long period of time in trillions and trillions of dollars. But what was the unemployment rate? Well, February 2020, it was 3.5%. There it is, February 2020. And then what is it today? Is it 3.5%? No, it is 3.9%. Now, 3.9% is still a pretty darn good number historically, but he hasn't improved the situation. In fact, it's slightly going up as we speak today. Well, what does Biden do to respond to all this? He goes big and he doubles down. This is what he does every single time. Okay? He messes up, and then he defends it anyway, he brags about it, and then doubles down. Biden budget proposal would raise taxes on large corporations and quote-unquote lower the deficit over 10 years. Is that true? How could it possibly be true? They always have new ideas. What they do is they project over 10 years, they say we're going to save all this money, and then next year they come up with a new $1 trillion spending plan that wipes out that entire deficit, and no one ever remembers it, all the deficit savings. Biden's big plans wield new budget to stay on offense post SOTU. And then how much do you want to spend? You're going to tell me we're going to spend it. We're going to save $1 trillion. This is his proposed budget. Here we go. $7.3 trillion. $7.3 trillion he's going to spend, and what he wants you to believe is that's going to save you money. Do you believe it? Do you? Are you as stupid as he thinks you are? I mean, I know his own voters are. His own voters will eat this stuff up. I know you're not. But I don't know, the person you work with, are they on top of this? Your friend from college, is he on top of this? The people you see in the streets, are they on top of this? I think the answer to that is quite clearly no in many cases. And if they don't know this information, they're going to believe the economy is a lot better than it is. And if they believe that, number one, they'll believe anything. But number two, they will likely go on and vote for Joe Biden. And if they do, we'll get more of this. And I got news for you. There's no budget savings coming in that budget. Not a little bit.